They're going very quiet on us. I think I'd better make a start. Warden, friends and colleagues, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this year's George Antonius Memorial Lecture. This sounds a little loud even to me. All right. The Antonius has always served as the climax of our academic year here in the Middle East Center. It's the crowning event in a year that's always replete with lectures and with workshops and with conferences. This year has been no exception. We've witnessed over 70 events at the center by my count. Rabia, you can correct me, proving that this marketplace of ideas has been particularly rich in exchange this year. The Antonius is also an opportunity to gather the Middle East Center family for one last bash before exams and the long summer holiday disperse our community in all the directions in which they go. In addition to our current students and colleagues, it's a great pleasure to welcome back honorary fellows, emeriti fellows, members of our advisory board, and friends of the Middle East Center of many years standing. I wanted to extend a particular word of thanks to the poet and philanthropist Abdelaziz Saoud El-Babtain and his colleagues from the El-Babtain Foundation, but they're not here. I'm still going to say this. We began this academic year with a remarkable conference that we co-hosted with the El-Babtain Foundation. It was their 15th session, convened here in Oxford in October of 2015. This morning we celebrated that happy occasion with a tree planting ceremony and a plaque laying outside the Middle East Center, with the plaque commemorating not just the 2015 conference, but also celebrating the humanitarian work of the people of Kuwait, who were named a humanitarian center by the Secretary General of the United Nations for their country's great work for refugee relief, particularly Syrian refugees. The El-Babtain Foundation elected to honor Professor Noam Chomsky with their gold medal at that conference. When the Chomskys were prevented by personal circumstances from traveling to attend the conference, we decided to reschedule the award ceremony to Trinity Term, when we might welcome Noam Chomsky as our Antonius speaker. The award ceremony, as I said, was held earlier today in the InvestCorp Lecture Theater, and now we have the pleasure of tonight's lecture. But I wanted to extend our center's warmest thanks to Mr. El-Babtain for his generous support in making this event possible. Finally, I'd like to begin what I hope will be a new tradition of remembering the late Professor George Scanlon and thanking him for the genesis of this lecture series and for his unstinting support over the years, spanning nearly 4 decades. In his lifetime, George is remembered only as the quote-unquote anonymous benefactor, one of Oxford's worst-kept secrets, but a secret nonetheless. In last year's lecture given by Professor Scott Redford, we paid tribute to George's unique contribution to Islamic archaeology and opened the floor to George's many friends and colleagues for them to share their tributes and memories of life with George Scanlon. But it would not do to leave matters there. George thought these lectures up in Katie Antonius's Cairo garden back in the early 1970s. He graced the majority of the lectures himself with his irrepressible presence. And over the years, there was always that check to help make ends meet when we came to convene the Antonius Lecture. He even deigned to give the 25th lecture himself, still anonymous. We remember you, George, with thanks and affection, and we miss you tonight. Since the first lecture given in 1976 by Professor George Makdisi, the Antonius has attracted some of the greatest thinkers of Middle Eastern affairs to St. Antony's College. To name but a few: Albert Hourani, Afaf Marceau, Ibrahim Abul-Lughod, Oleg Grabar, Eric Rouleau, Edward Said, Ghassan Twaini, Zaha Hadid, Rima Khalaf Hanedi, Robert Fisk. The list is long and most distinguished. But we've waited 41 years for the honor of welcoming Noam Chomsky to this podium. By the time he emerged as a public intellectual at the height of the Vietnam War, Noam Chomsky had already established his reputation as America's most innovative linguist and was a tenured professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which has proven his intellectual home from 1955 down to the present day. As a scholar, Professor Chomsky was one of MIT's greatest assets. As a public intellectual, he must have proven something of a liability. But it is very much to MIT's credit that they supported Professor Chomsky's academic freedom throughout, providing him a platform to deploy his academic celebrity, to denounce injustice, the abuse of human rights, and to promote free speech. In the course of his career, he has consistently denounced the aggression of greater powers over weaker states. He was an outspoken critic of the American invasion of Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War years. He condemned American intervention in Nicaragua during the Reagan years. Having just had Jose Ramos Horta here to speak in college, it's worth pointing out that Noam Chomsky was one of very few public intellectuals to speak out on behalf of the people of Timor-Leste throughout the years of the Indonesian occupation. And he spoke out against the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory and the unqualified American support that so obstructed the peaceful resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. In his 1983 book, The Fateful Triangle, The United States, Israel, and the Palestinians, Noam Chomsky laid bare the essential dishonesty of American policies in the aftermath of the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the siege of Beirut. He wrote, "It is surely hypocritical to condemn Israel for establishing settlement in the occupied territories while we pay for establishing and expanding them. Or to condemn Israel for attacking civilian targets with cluster and phosphorus bombs when we provide them gratis, knowing that they will be used for this purpose. In general, it is pure hypocrisy to criticize the exercise of Israeli power while welcoming Israel's contributions towards realizing the US aim of eliminating possible threats, largely indigenous, to American domination of the Middle East region." It's hard to convey the impact of those words at the time in which they came out. You have to go back to 1983 to appreciate just how taboo it was to make such an open criticism both of Israel and of America's relationship with Israel. But for those who believe that America, far from serving as an honest broker, was the essential obstruction to resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict, Professor Chomsky provided evidence and arguments to make their case with his eloquence. Though writing on Israel and Palestine was not in any sense a good career move, I don't think it earned you any plaudits in the profession. Noam Chomsky has never relented. Witness his recent co-authored works with Ilan Pappé. God help me. Will you all turn your telephones off, please?
That was the FBI.
No, it gets worse because the phone call is from Mr. El-Babtain. So I'm going to hand the telephone to my colleague Mohammed Shaheen for a second and let him take that one for me. Hello? As I said, this does stand as something of a family gathering. Where was I? The writing on Israel and Palestine was not in any sense a good career move. Noam Chomsky has never relented. Witness his recent co-authored works with Ilan Pappé on Palestine and Gaza in Crisis, Reflections on Israel's War Against the Palestinians. It is this commitment, spanning 4 decades, that makes Noam Chomsky such a compelling Antonius lecturer. His subject tonight, the United States, the Middle East, and our collective fate. Will you please forgive the interruptions and join me in warmly welcoming Noam Chomsky to the court. I'm so sorry.
The masterwork that inspired this series of lectures begins by stating that the story of the Arab national movement opens in Syria in 1847. Exactly 150 years later, in his incisive 1997 Antonius lecture devoted to the interactions of the Arab world with the West, Galal Amin came rather close to declaring that this monumental process had reached its end, as he described the situation at the end of the 20th century, mostly quoting now, the Arab national movement has been subsumed under a general Middle East on the American-Israeli model, in which one may not even recognize an Arab when he sees one, or know what an Arab really means. Amin traces this development to the early 1990s, when, as he says, an important change seems to have occurred in the process of westernizing the Arab world, the last act of the whole drama of the Arab-Western relationship, which is not happening through Europe nor the United States, but mainly through Israel. Amin provides an interesting perspective, and though I think some qualifications are in order, to which I'll return, look at the wreckage of the Arab world today, it might seem to confirm the grim prognosis. Syria, the birthplace of the Arab national movement, is a gruesome disaster, which might lead us to conclude that the movement born in Syria is dying in Syria. But it's worth recalling what happened in Syria a century ago, vividly depicted by Antonius. Hundreds of thousands dead from starvation, and probably a higher percentage of total deaths than any other belligerent in that hideous war, an account that's confirmed in Eugene Rogan's scholarly study of the fall of the Ottoman Empire. But Syria revived. The Arab Spring is now often named the Arab Winter. The uprisings were largely crushed in the Gulf states, those of prime concern for the West. In Tunisia, the remnants are surviving, not without threats. Libya was destroyed by NATO bombing, terrible repercussions in West Africa and beyond. Egypt is plunging into some of its darkest days. The Western powers opposed the popular uprisings, contrary to self-congratulatory rhetorical flourishes when it seemed briefly that the tide could not be reversed. In Egypt, they are now celebrating the revival of the Mubarak era neoliberal disaster that was a prime target of the popular protests, particularly for the militant labor movement that was a driving force. In 2015, President al-Sisi convened the Egypt Economic Development Conference, which heralded Egypt the future, attracting a flock of Davos men to marvel at the new Egypt that is open for business, a World Bank managing director cheerily proclaimed. The reality of the celebration is vividly depicted by Jack Shankers, one of the close observers of the Egyptian uprising and its aftermath. The people of Egypt, as he reports, were missing from the celebrations. The chief executive of BP gave a major address, but there was no mention of the communities that fought to prevent BP from destroying their lands, their life with a gas processing plant. The Davos men could enjoy authentic Bedouin dances, while the real Bedouins, driven off their land by state multinational projects, were kept safely out of sight behind the security fence, like the real Cairenes, who were removed from the streets for the propaganda video depicting the grand new Cairo that welcomes foreign investors. Nevertheless, Schenker reminds us that the Egyptian people, time and again and against the odds, have made their presence and autonomy felt by brazenly contesting different variants of regime power, and since January 2011, they have propelled themselves unstoppably onto the political stage. Adam Hania adds that this promise of revolt remains ever present in the political moment, extending beyond the Middle East, belonging to all who seek a different world. He describes the upheavals that began in Tunisia and Egypt and reverberating throughout the region as the most significant revolts the Middle East has seen in over 5 decades, drawing millions into mass political action for the first time in generations, seriously shaking established state structures and the grip of repressive Western allied regimes. Their regional scope pointed to the commonalities and shared experiences of people throughout the Middle East with an impact felt across the world. Another close observer, Middle East labor historian Joel Binen, describes the new political discourse and the confidence of activists that we collectively can affect political change and can carry forward the far-reaching potential of the Arab Spring, which is only the beginning of a long-term revolutionary process that will have successes and regressions, as Gilbert Achcar has counseled from the earliest days. And I think there is good reason to expect that the forces unleashed 5 years ago will burst forth again. In outlining what he called what may be the last act of the whole drama of the Arab-Western relationship, Ghalal Amin perhaps assigns too much significance to the Israeli role, in my opinion. It cannot be dissociated from U.S. power in the manner that his remarks might suggest. Israeli power and influence is crucially dependent on the decisive military, diplomatic, economic, even ideological support of the reigning superpower. Without it, Israel could not have pursued its expansionist course since 1967, nor can it carry it forward today. And Israeli leaders are well aware of the risks of this dependency. They're now seeking to expand Israel's base of support to the east, primarily to China and India. India is becoming a very natural ally for a number of reasons, including the drift in both societies towards ultranationalism, reactionary internal policies, and hatred of Islam. The reasons for Israel's looking east for support are outlined by Mark Heller, principal research associate at Tel Aviv's Institution for National Security Studies. He explains, quoting him, "Over the long term, there are problems for Israel in its relations with Western Europe and the United States, while in contrast, the important Asian countries don't seem to indicate much interest in how Israel gets along with the Palestinians, Arabs, or anyone else. So in short, China, India, Singapore, other favored allies, are less influenced by the kinds of liberal and humane concerns that sometimes influence Western policies." Amplifying his remarks, Yoram Meital, chairman of the Chaim Herzog Center for Middle East Studies and Diplomacy, Ben-Gurion University, he adds that as long as the eyes of the international community are on Islamic State and on Syria, Prime Minister Netanyahu knows they're not going to twist his arm with the Palestinian card. Accordingly, illegal expansion, repression of the Palestinian enemy can proceed on course. Pressure from Washington, for the moment, is very slight, but Israeli analysts are right to be concerned that it might grow. Israel's image is very visibly deteriorating among important sectors of the U.S. population. That's strikingly true among college-educated youth, and there's growing commitment to Palestinian rights. Among self-described liberal Democrats, most sympathize more with Palestinians than Israel, according to recent polls, which is a dramatic shift over the years. And for the first time, this is becoming a serious issue in the politics of the Democratic Party. Just as in the international arena, so also within the United States, popular support for Israel is drifting more towards the right. Ultranationalists, anti-immigrants, those who hate and fear Muslims, evangelical Christians, who are a huge sector in the United States. They form much of the base of the Republican Party, and others like them. Much actually as was predicted by opponents of the occupation in its early years. And the day may soon come when Israel will not be able to count on the kind of support that has been generally forthcoming ever since, from the United States, ever since Israel made the fateful decision almost half a century ago to reject security in favor of expansion, counting on its superpower patron to protect it from the consequences that were predicted at once and that are now apparent: moral decline, security threats, and international isolation, which by now may be having economic effects as Israel's economy heads towards likely recession, quite possibly, some analysts conclude, because of what they call a quiet boycott of Israeli goods, decline in investment resulting from distaste with Israel's policy. Years ago, the striking correlation between favorable diplomatic prospects and economic health was a staple of discussion in Israel, but with the drift to the ultranationalist right within the political system, the likely connection is raised now only by the marginal merits group, which is the last remnant of the center-left. The important change to which Galal Amin alludes was in the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed. Of course, a significant turning point in world affairs with many consequences. One consequence was in the ideological and doctrinal domain. The standard justification for policy decisions throughout the Cold War was straightforward. The Russians are coming, so we have no choice. The disappearance of the superpower enemy provided a very sharp test for evaluating the doctrine. The results are quite illuminating, and they bear directly on U.S. relations with the Middle East. So consider NATO. NATO was established and maintained to defend Europe from the Russian hordes. 1991, no more Russian hordes, no more Warsaw Pact. Mikhail Gorbachev was offering a vision of a cooperative security system extending all over most of Eurasia without any confrontational military alliances. Responding to this remarkable opportunity, the Bush, this is Bush 1, of course, the Bush-Baker administration decided not only to maintain NATO, but to expand it right away to the eastern zone of newly unified Germany. That was in violation, too, of verbal commitments to Gorbachev that were designed to mislead Russia, while U.S. dominance extended to the east. Recent archival research has persuasively shown that. Under Clinton, NATO expanded further to the east in 2008 and 2013, that's under Obama, and NATO even offered membership to Ukraine, the Russian geopolitical heartland, long historical, cultural relationships. George Kennan and other senior statesmen warned early on that NATO enlargement was a tragic mistake, a policy error of historic proportions, their words. It's now leading to rising tensions on the Russian border, the traditional invasion route through which Russia was virtually destroyed twice during the last century by Germany alone. And the risk of nuclear war is not slight. NATO's mission today, historian Richard Sakwa writes, its mission today is to manage the risks created by its existence. That's pretty accurate. Meanwhile, NATO's official mission has been extended well beyond official mission, notice, to control the global energy system, pipelines and sea lanes, and unofficially to serve as an intervention force under U.S. command, as we have seen, long forgotten and apparently intended only to mislead are the promises of George H.W. Bush and James Baker to Gorbachev that NATO would become what they called a mere political alliance. That was in return for Gorbachev's agreement to allow German unification within NATO, which was quite a remarkable concession in the light of history. Well, the fate of NATO, if you think about it, shines a bright light on the real nature of the Cold War and its doctrinal basis. And what it reveals had not passed entirely unnoticed in mainstream scholarship. So a decade earlier, the distinguished Harvard professor of the science of government advisor, Samuel Huntington, had observed that, as he put it, you may have to sell intervention or other military action in such a way as to create the misimpression that it is the Soviet Union that you're fighting. Now, that's what the United States has done ever since the Truman Doctrine in 1947. That was 1981. And as the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, pursuing the same logic, Huntington warned that Gorbachev's public relations can be as much of a threat to American interests in Europe as were Brezhnev's tanks. The conclusions suggested by the fate of NATO are underscored by other evidence. As the Soviet enemy disappeared, the Bush-Baker administration, of course, produced a new national security strategy and military budget. The basic message was that everything would remain pretty much the same, though with new pretexts. So it would be necessary to maintain an enormous military system, and not for defense against the Russians, but because of what was called the technological sophistication of third world powers. And if you're a civilized, educated intellectual, you don't laugh when you read that. It would also be necessary to maintain intervention forces aimed at the Middle East, where, as they put it internally, the serious threats to our interests could not have been laid at the Kremlin's door, contrary to decades of pretense. With the clouds lifting, it could no longer be concealed that the major threat all along had been what's called radical nationalism, meaning independent nationalism that might get out of control. To borrow Henry Kissinger's phrase, it might be a virus that would spread contagion beyond, leading to erosion of control over broad regions of the world. There's ample evidence from both internal documents and the historical events themselves that concerns over viruses that might spread contagion has been a leading theme of superpower policy since World War II. There are ample precedents before. For the minor superpower, that was a motive for its interventions in its Eastern European domains. For the world dominant power, it was the motive for intervention and subversion over most of the world. from Latin America to Asia to the Middle East. To mention only one Middle East example that remains of great significance today, there's substantial evidence that a leading motive for the US-UK overthrow of the parliamentary regime in Iran in 1953, a leading motive was the concern that the contagion of national independence might spread to Egypt, where British rule was tottering. These are matters explored in some depth by Ervan Abrahamian in the most far-reaching scholarly analysis of the coup. But scattered illustrations are actually misleading because the policies are pervasive and understandable. Military commanders also understood that the end of the Cold War would not change security policies significantly. So Marine General A.M. Gray wrote that the majority of the crises we have responded to since the end of World War II have not directly involved the Soviet Union. The problems remain as before, insurgencies resulting from the underdeveloped world's growing dissatisfaction over the gap between rich and poor nations, which may jeopardize regional stability and our access to vital economic and military resources on which the U.S. and its allies will become more and more dependent. And notice this is not left Marxist critique in a small journal. This is mainstream publication in military journals after the clouds have lifted. No more Russians coming. You have to report the facts sort of as they were. And interestingly, it has barely entered into scholarship, which is also interesting. We must, going on with General Gray, we must therefore maintain within our active force structure a credible military power projection capability with the flexibility to respond to conflict across the spectrum of violence throughout the globe to ensure unimpeded access to developing economic markets throughout the world and to the resources needed to support our manufacturing requirements. That's General Gray. The same understanding was reflected in the policy doctrines of the Clinton administration, which came into office shortly after. The Clinton doctrine held that, quoting, the United States is entitled to resort to unilateral use of military power to ensure uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources. Taken literally, the Clinton doctrine was more expansive than George W. Bush's national security strategy, which aroused fear and concern throughout the world, elicited harsh criticism even at the heart of the foreign policy establishment in the United States. The more expansive Clinton doctrine, in contrast, was barely noticed. It's largely a reflection of rhetorical style, not content, which is the opposite. Another 1989 document focused on what it called cases where the U.S. confronts much weaker enemies. That's the only kind that remained with the Soviet Union on the verge of collapse. And analysts advised that in such conflicts, the U.S. must defeat the much weaker enemies decisively and rapidly. Any other outcome will be embarrassing and might undercut political support, which is understood to be quite thin. So the message must be shock and awe, as the world was soon to learn. And in fact, an opportunity arose very soon. A couple of months later, in August 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, either disobeying or possibly misunderstanding orders from the U.S. That crime instantly ended Washington's embrace of the dictator, which went back to Reagan's decision to support the Iraqi invasion of Iran. And that embrace was warm indeed. It's now kept quiet because it is kind of embarrassing. The U.S. provided aid and diplomatic support to Saddam, extending right through his worst crimes. Washington, of course, was fully aware of Iraqi responsibility for the Halabja massacre, but the administration sought to assign the blame to Iran. Saddam was even granted a gift that is otherwise enjoyed only by Israel, namely to attack a U.S. ship, the USS Stark, killing several dozen sailors, and to escape with a tap on the wrist. It's reminiscent of the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty in 1967. The U.S. finally entered the war directly, patrolling the Gulf to protect Iraqi shipping. In the course of those operations, the USS Vincennes shot down an Iranian civilian airliner in a clearly marked civilian corridor, killing 290 people, an act that may have convinced Ayatollah Khomeini to abandon the conflict, so historian De La Puro suggests. After the hostilities ended, President Bush, that's number one, the statesman, provided badly needed agricultural aid to Iraq and invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to the United States for advanced training in weapons production. That was 1989. In April 1990, President Bush sent a high-level senatorial delegation to Iraq, led by Senate Majority Leader, future Republican presidential candidate Bob Dole. The purpose was to convey the president's greetings to his friend Saddam and to assure him that his problems did not lie with the U.S. government, but what they called the haughty and pampered press. 4 months later, Saddam instantly changed from admired friend to the new Hitler. Saddam seems to have quickly realized that he had made a serious error, and he began seeking ways to somehow end the conflict. But Washington had other ideas. Colin Powell, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, warned internally that Saddam might withdraw, quoting him, "putting his puppet in, and everyone in the Arab world will be happy." And that wouldn't do. There were, in fact, options for peaceful settlement in the coming months. They were dismissed, they barely even reported, and with no Russian or other deterrent, the resulting war devastated Iraq. The war with the destruction was followed by a sanctions regime that was so murderous that the respected international diplomats who administered it both resigned in protest, condemning it as, in their words, genocidal. Then followed the US-UK invasion with consequences we need not discuss, including a disaster for the whole region, includes the rise of ISIS and the reconstruction of a potent pan-Sunni identity in the region under strong influence from monstrous Islamic extremism, something that, quoting Fawaz Gerges, discusses it in his recent book on the rise of ISIS. As the 1991 war ended, President Bush surveyed the wreckage and declared that in the New World Order, in his words, what we say goes. He turned at once to Israel-Palestine, initiated the Madrid negotiations. Participants included the internal Palestinians, but excluded the Tunis-based PLO. The negotiations ran aground because the Palestinian delegation, which was led by the respected nationalist Haider Abdel-Shafi, insisted on an end to settlement expansion as a condition. Meanwhile, apparently in an effort to maintain authority that was rapidly eroding, Yasser Arafat pursued the Norway option, leading to the Oslo Agreement, which imposed no impediments on settlement expansion, no impediments on Prime Minister Rabin's openly announced expansionist program, which was quite accurately outlined at the time in the Israeli press. My own feeling at the time, as I wrote, was that the Oslo process was doomed from the outset for, I thought, were pretty good reasons, but I'll put that aside here. Well, it's worth recalling the background, just pick out a few essential moments. Immediately after the 1967 war, June 67 war, Israel initiated a settlement and development program in the occupied territories. It's been pursued since in a way that need not be reviewed. There were some early Israeli gestures which appeared to be conciliatory, but as Avi Raz has revealed, they were completely meaningless. In Raz's words, Israel persistently, deliberately squandered every opportunity for a peaceful accommodation with its Arab adversaries in order to keep the territorial spoils of war. That began June 1967. Meanwhile, a potential diplomatic path opened. In April 1968, the chief of Nasser's National Security Council, Hassan Sabri al-Khoury, approached the American Middle East scholar, diplomat William Polk, with a far-reaching offer of political settlement. It was endorsed by Nasser and very much in accord with official U.S.-Israeli demands. Didn't mention refugees, even offered to place the United States in charge as what they called an honest broker. Polk forwarded the Egyptian message to Washington, but there's apparently no response, none that he knows of at least. In February 1971, in the course of the Gunnar Yaring negotiations, President Sadat offered Israel a full peace treaty in return for withdrawal from the occupied territories, though it was quite clear that he was concerned only with the Sinai, where Israel was then initiating major settlement and development programs. Israel considered the offer and rejected it. I think that's the most fateful decision in Israel's history. And not without precedent. The government was adopting the traditional negotiating stance of its founding father, David Ben-Gurion, as far back as the 1940s. That time was on Israel's side, and Israel could manage perfectly well without peace with the Arab states, sidelining outstanding issues. The United States supported Israel's rejection of peace and security that led to the 1973 war, which was no small matter, even led to a U.S. nuclear alert called by Henry Kissinger to warn the Russians to stay away after he had authorized Israel to violate the ceasefire that had been imposed by the U.S. and Russia. After that debacle, the U.S. and Israel had little choice but to accept Sadat's offer, led to diplomacy that was consummated at Camp David in 1978-79, where the United States and Israel formally accepted a version of Sadat's offer that was less acceptable to them than the 1971 offer, because it mentioned Palestinian national rights, which had not been mentioned before. This is portrayed as a Kissinger-Carter diplomatic triumph. More accurately, in terms of diplomacy, it was a complete catastrophe. Meanwhile, Palestinian national rights had moved to the international agenda. In January 1976, a two-state resolution was brought to the Security Council, UN Security Council, by Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, pretty much in the terms that have become an overwhelming international consensus since. The U.S. vetoed the resolution again in 1980, this time under Carter. In 1988, the Palestinian National Council formally accepted the two-state consensus. Israel responded, of course. It responded by declaring that there can be no additional Palestinian state between Israel and Jordan. Jordan is determined to be a Palestinian state by Israeli fiat, and added that the fate of the occupied territories would be settled in terms of Israeli guidelines with no authentic Palestinian participation. That declaration was pretty much accepted by the United States in December 1989 in what's called the Baker Plan. Then followed the first Gulf War, Madrid and Oslo. Israeli settlement and infrastructure programs continued, constant U.S. support. The U.S. and Israel also moved right away to separate Gaza from the West Bank. That's in violation of the Oslo agreements, which declared that they're a territorial unity whose integrity can't be broken. That's a crucial matter because it means separating the two, because it means that any potential possible Palestinian autonomy in the West Bank would have no access to the outside world, particularly as Israel develops the Jordan Valley, expelling Palestinians. It's obvious just from a look at the map. Shimon Peres became prime minister after Rabin's assassination in 1995. In his final press conference a year later, Peres reiterated firmly the Labor Party principle that there would never be a Palestinian state. Peres was replaced by Benjamin Netanyahu, whose administration was actually the first to officially contemplate a Palestinian state. Minister David Bar-Ilan informed the press that Palestinians can call whatever fragments are left to them a state if they like, or he said they can call them fried chicken. A year later, in May 1997, the Labor Party, apparently for the first